So watercolor is a medium that I use as a sort of way of playing with paint. I like to watercolor paint, and it has a very particular way of behaving. For children, it can be very simple. One of the first things you have to decide is what kind of paper you're going to use. There is designated watercolor paper, but that tends to be kind of expensive, and it's what artists use, but there's no need for that with children. What you do need is an absorbent type of paper. So feel the kind of papers that you have in your center. They'll all have different finishes. You know, this is manila, and then there's construction paper, which I don't recommend. It becomes too soggy, because with watercolor, you do use water, obviously. It doesn't work without it. So for today, I'm just going to use small pieces, and I would say that whatever kind of paper you choose, offer it to children in different sizes. Just have it on a shelf or a table in sort of small, medium, and large. And in that way, children can become intentional. They can think about, what's my idea? Is my idea huge? Do I need this great big piece of easel paper? Or is my idea tiny? Am I going to draw a bug, you know? And then you would use a smaller piece of paper. And so if the papers are displayed nicely, the children make some intentional choices. So this has sort of a soft absorbent finish, and I'm going to use two pieces for a particular reason. I want to talk a little bit about brushes. Brushes are very important for any kind of artist, for any kind of painting, no matter what you're using. Even if you're using liquid temper, the brush is important. What comes with a watercolor set is not usually very good quality, and a brush like this, you can't get it even if it's wet. It's very hard to get it to a fine point, and you might need a fine point for some reason. So these kinds of brushes I would get rid of, and I would use something like this, which comes in a set. You can get them at places like Michael's and other art shops. They come in a set, and look at all the different shapes and sizes. So we have straight edges. This comes to a very nice point. So it is a very beautiful brush. I probably would tend to use myself that kind of brush the most. Then you've got very fine brushes, and there's no reason why children can't use these brushes. Once they're past that fist grip of toddlerhood, which with the stubby brushes and the heavy liquid paint, once they're past that stage and they're starting to hold a paintbrush more like this, there's no reason why they can't use all these very nice brushes. Of course, you have to take care of brushes if they're going to stay like this. And so what we do when we're finished is wash them off. The children can wash them off, bring them back to a point, and don't send them up like this to dry, because the water will trickle back into this metal holder of the bristles, and it will rust. So you lay it flat on a piece of paper towel, and that's how they're supposed to dry, and that will make your brushes last longer. So there's a couple of things you can do with watercolor paint when introducing them to children, and you can let this happen quite naturally. So I'm going to use a thicker brush, and I'm just going to wet the paper without anything on it. No paint, no nothing, just wet paper. And when you put paint, you have to load up your wet brush, and then you can start to make marks. And what will happen with wet paint on wet paper is that the paints will run into each other, which is actually a very nice effect. And you can also just wet your brush and without putting more paint on it, and just do this. And the paint will get more and more faded. Useful for skies, for those of you who are trying to represent something. So if you hold it up vertically, you can see that the paint runs quite nicely, which is a beautiful effect. Children really like this effect of running on the paper. They like to twist it in different directions. So all sorts of things you can do with wet paper. With dry paper, you can make more specific marks, of course. So you still always have to wet the brush. On dry paper, your paint is going to stay where you put it. But notice what happens when I pull the paint across the page. So if I use the side of my brush, you can make a nice thick stroke, you can fill in a lot of space. But if I use the point, the very point, you can get a very fine line and everything in between. Of course, children just need to experiment with the brushes to find out how this works, experiment with dry and with wet. What I sometimes do with children when they're first introduced to watercolor paint is I'll take a piece of paper this size and fold it in two. When children start to discover that wet paper acts differently than dry paper, I'll invite them, so what would happen, I wonder what would happen, here's an I wonder question, if you wet one side but you didn't wet the other, what would happen? And let them experiment with that. So that's just another way of introducing wet and dry. The most important thing about materials and children is that we want children to use materials with respect. So with a brush like this, we don't want them to smush it. We don't want them to hold it like this and smush it. It's going to wreck the bristles. It won't work anymore. So one thing we can do when we're introducing a new type of brush to a child is to say, this looks a little different than the brushes you've used before. What do you see that's different? And ask them to identify what the difference is. It will likely look quite different to what they've used before. And then just say to them, you know, with a brush like this, it's very pointy. So you could make a different kind of line with a brush like this. Why don't you try it out? And just leave them to it. Leave them to experiment with very fine lines and very thick lines. The point is that we don't want to be telling them what to do, what to make and how to make it. We don't want that at all, because then we'd be getting into product. We want to be in process. And so it's for the children to experiment. We just want to give them a couple of tips for them to be able to respect the materials and so that the materials will last. So they should be having fun with this and using it in many, many different ways.